up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, just welcome. My name is Gemma Jade, and tonight we are recounting stories of the BEK, Black-Eyed Kids or Black-Eyed Children. If you haven't seen the first video, I'll put it right here, but be sure after you watch that one to pop back in and watch this one. These are pretty interesting. I have a personal account from a friend of mine, so that's really cool to hear him recount his story personally instead of having to read it, even though reading it's just as fun. I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to actually read my script out tonight just because it's a little bit easier. It'll help me create the eerie vibe. I wanted to get into the Halloween spirit. So let's just dive right in. As I sit writing this, it's about 6 o'clock in the morning and still super dark out here in northern New Jersey. As I drink my coffee and smoke my vape, I can't help but feel the fear creeping into me as I sit at my dining room table reading these stories and typing on my little Chromebook. My chair facing the huge uncovered bay windows with my front door, also with a large uncovered window on it, staring back at me to the right. A BEK's dream come true, in other words, nothing to hide behind when they come calling. Let's start with a brief summary of what the BEKs are and what they do, how they approach you, so to speak, and what to look for. According to Wikipedia, they are, quote, an American contemporary legend of paranormal creatures resembling children between the ages of 6 and 16, with pale skin and black eyes, who are reportedly seen hitchhiking or panhandling or are encountered on doorsteps of residential homes, end quote. So, making the assumption here that you are at least a little bit familiar with this phenomenon, or if you're not, and you went back and watched my part 1 video, let's get started. Let's jump right in. The first story I want to recount comes from a good friend of mine. He recently shared this story on YouTube in a guest spot he did in a Halloween special for another YouTube channel, and he actually gave me permission to retell it on my channel. He actually requested that I do. The first thing he states before recounting his story is that every time he recounts the story, something sinister and unexplained happens to him. He's part Cherokee, which so am I, and he states how he's always reluctant to retell of any kind of paranormal encounters that he has, including the BEK, because of the old Native American legends about how if you speak of things like this out loud, you could be inviting it to you. And I totally believe that, which makes me even more scared. It's actually nighttime now that I'm filming. I'm home alone. So let's hope we don't get a knock. Sometimes that's the scariest thought of all for me, you know? What kind of juju am I bringing upon myself in retelling these tales? This story that I'm about to recount can be heard told in the first person point of view of the victim, because yes, I believe anyone a BEK approaches is definitely a victim. They're usually traumatized, their pets are never the same again, and sometimes they're never the same again. So it can be heard on the Missing Persons and Mysteries YouTube channel, and the title of the video is Black-Eyed Kids Stories / Halloween Special. Again, I have no clue how to link things in the description box, so you guys are just going to have to figure out how to search Missing Persons and Mysteries and look for the BEK Halloween Special. So here it is. This is Steve Stockton's BEK story. Hi, Steve. Hope I can make you proud and do you justice. Steve says he was leaving work late one night, super late. He had a freelance job at the time and would go in and work after regular employees all left for the day. So he finishes his work and he says he left the building at about 2 o'clock in the morning and was carrying some things, equipment and tools and the things he used to work, to his car, which at the time was one of those little tiny Mazda Miata convertibles. These cars are just 2-seaters, by the way. They're super small. He reminds us that the place he is working at is in a very industrialized area. There are no residential homes at all. So as his hands are full of all of his work equipment that he's going to try to put into this tiny little car, he says he notices that, quote, way over at the edge of the parking lot, there's 2 little girls sitting on the curb, end quote. It immediately struck him how strange and uncommon this was, keeping in mind the area and also the time of night or day. It's 2 a.m. The top happened to be down on his tiny little Mazda Miata, so he just started loading things into the trunk. He joked that the trunk in these cars is, quote, not much bigger than the glove box on a lot of cars, and it's a bit like Tetris to try and fit a lot of stuff in the trunk, end quote. As he's struggling to get the equipment in the car, he notices that the little girls have now stood up, and he said the larger of the two girls looked 11 or 12, with the smaller of the two girls looking to be 9 or 10. So not so much an age difference between the two as far as he can tell. He couldn't tell who was younger or older. He kind of stated just because the one girl was taller didn't necessarily mean she was older. That's neither here nor there, but that's what the man said. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, as he's trying to fit all of this massive amount of stuff into the tiny trunk, he suddenly hears the larger girl start talking. He said she wasn't talking to him. She was actually talking to the smaller of the two girls about him. Steve said, quote, and it was almost like a litany, end quote, with the girl stating over and over again, quote, he'll give us a ride. He'll let us in his car. He'll have to let us go. He can't leave us out here. We're lost and scared and it's 2 a.m. He'll have to give us a ride. He'll let us in his car. He's not going to leave us stranded, end quote. She was just repeating these same things over and over and over again, nonstop. The smaller girl wasn't saying anything. She wasn't even responding at all. She seemed to be just staring vacantly and listening to this litany coming from the older girl. This is very typical, actually, in these types of stories, that there's a younger-looking BEK and an older-looking BEK, and usually the older-looking one is the one that does all the talking and seems to have all the authority, while the younger-looking one just kind of stands there either staring at the ground or stands there looking almost inhumanly still. So Steve turns away from these two girls and continues with his task, loading stuff into the trunk. When he turned to look again 2 or 3 minutes later, Steve said he did not actually see the girls move because he was busy, doing what he was doing, but now they were halfway across the parking lot, much closer to him when he looked up this time than when he had put his head down just 2 minutes ago. A minute or so after this, after he notices that they somehow crossed halfway across the parking lot, he looks up and he says, quote, and this time they really closed the distance. I didn't see them walk. They were only walking when I wasn't looking, I presume, end quote. Steve finally gets a good look at them, and he says they were, quote, dressed oddly, end quote. He further describes their attire by saying that they were wearing very simple clothing with dark hoodies and dark colored pants. He said about their hoodies, quote, sweatshirts with the hoods pulled up, end quote. The reason this was so odd is because they were inappropriately dressed for the extremely warm weather. He couldn't see their faces still, though, and he said, quote, it still looked black in there, end quote, meaning, he couldn't see their face inside, this of the hoodie, it looks black. The taller girl was still talking at, quote, 90 miles an hour, end quote. She was still repeating over and over again, quote, he won't leave us out here. He'll let us in the car. He won't leave us stranded. He'll do it. He won't leave us here. He'll let us in, end quote. Steve said at this point he was really getting spooked because every time he looked up, they were getting closer to him and he wasn't seeing them move at all. And the taller of the two girls kept repeating these same things over and over again about him letting them in their car, that he has to do it, everything I just said, to the smaller girl who still was just seemingly looking at the ground and not paying any attention to anything going on, which is weird. He looked up again, but this time they were directly under the streetlight. And this time he could finally see their faces. He said, quote, and I could see that they had the biggest, blackest eyes. I mean, like so black as to not exist. It was that type of black. A pitch black. If you've ever been in a cave underground with no lights on, it was that kind of darkness. Just an inky blackness for their eyes, end quote. Steve stated, quote, and like I said, I just felt this fear just start rolling over me in waves. And now, to tell the story, it seems so ridiculous. It's two little girls, end quote. He said the fear didn't make sense to him, even though the circumstances seemed odd, being that he was in the middle of an industrial business area at 2 o'clock in the morning and there were two little girls in the parking lot with one of them incessantly jabbering on about getting into his car. He said he just knew it couldn't be a good thing that two little girls want to ride in a two-seater car in the middle of the night with a strange man. Steve said, quote, "First of all, I'm not going to put two kids in the seat of a car that's just meant for one person, and I don't want to be out running around under those circumstances, 2 o'clock in the morning with two underage girls, in a car," end quote. Steve once again starts recounting the fear that he felt about these two kids. He stated, quote, "But the fear that I felt come rolling off those two, even now, when I talk about it, I get a little antsy. It's just like every time I talk about it, I relive it," end quote. He said he never felt such a fear like that, and he described it as, quote, "a real feral fight or flight type thing," end quote. He likened it to a live rat being thrown into a pet snake's cage, the fear it must have when it senses the snake and knows that it's doomed. I loved this analogy because it really does seem to sum up the fear and the feeling that these kids give to people. This is how everybody who's encountered them describes it. Not so eloquently, but this is the fear they're explaining, like being in a rat in a cage with a snake and knowing that it's over. Basically, that fear you get when you sense a predator. He said he felt just like a mouse that was in a cage with a snake, stating, quote, "Well, that's how I felt, just like that mouse, just such an overwhelming fear that it was really beyond fight or flight," end quote. Steve mentioned a couple of other times, many times in his life, where he had paranormal encounters. It was kind of like, I don't want to say a normal thing for him, but he has had more than one paranormal encounter. And he said he had never felt a fear like this in his life. He called it, quote, "strange and irrational," end quote. So by this point, he said that he had finally gotten his stuff in his car, but he was fumbling for the keys because he just wanted to get into his car and get the heck away from these two little girls. As I stated earlier, he had luckily left the top down because he could not get his keys into the door to open it. So he just hopped right over the door and into the car. And I don't know if it was in his haste or in his panic or if something else was going on. He was having trouble starting the car as the girls were kind of closing in on him. They were right on top of the car at this point. And the girl was still repeating her litany, incessant rambling about Steve letting them into the car and not leaving them stranded. Steve said the larger of the two girls was still talking about him, not directly to him. And that's very odd and kind of weird and creepy in any circumstance. But when you're looking at two BEKs and that's what's going on, it's got to be even more so, to the nth degree that there are no words to describe. The younger girl was still standing there completely mute, seemingly listening, seemingly zoned out. When Steve was finally able to get his car started and moving, he said the girls were so close to the car that they could have jumped in at that point if they wanted to. But remember, the BEK have to be invited. Steve said that he just floored it, the pedal to the floor, and he didn't even bother making a right or left out of the parking lot. He just kind of went over this grassy area and hopped the curb and took off and did not even bother looking back. I'm sure if he had bothered, there would have been no one in the rearview mirror. Steve stated that he had a girlfriend at the time that lived very close to where this encounter happened, and he would usually just go to her house after working so late at this particular job. But he said that night that thought didn't even occur to him. He said he headed 15 to 17 miles away to his parents' house instead of going to his girlfriend's house, who was much closer. And I have to wonder, was this his instinct, his internal fear, trying to get him as far away as possible from these two black-eyed children? Well, that was story number 1, and I told you guys last time that I was going to just read the story and not kind of tell it in my own words, but because I was recounting this from audio, I hope once again, Steve, that I did your story justice. Now I'm going to just read something from Thought Catalog titled, "Are Black-Eyed Kids Real?" And then I'll get to the story that I was talking about in the last video about the telegraph. Are black-eyed kids real? There is good reason to suspect black-eyed children are a real phenomenon. The original sighting in 1996 was by a newspaper reporter whose interest in telling the story of what he experienced was more out of curiosity than fame-seeking. To this day, he maintains that the story happened the way he originally told it. There are also many, many independent eyewitness accounts spread throughout multiple countries who have described similar experiences. They corroborate each other with the same MO. The children have pale appearance with all black eyes, appearing in twos or threes, clothing style out of date, needing to gain access to the witness's vehicle or home, to the victim's vehicle or home. It's also important to keep in mind, and I've thought this myself, the Black Eyed Kids story isn't that phenomenal. If someone were making up a story, they might try harder to make it more interesting or fantastical. The situations described seem creepy, but not like the plot of a horror movie, just an everyday situation with some kids that seem strange in it. Let's move on to another really creepy story from Reddit that I'm reading, not from Reddit though, from Thought Catalog. I guess they reposted it. Here goes. Sorry about the lighting change, guys. It's a new system and I'm trying it out, and I put the wrong one on in the beginning. Here it is. Every story I've read about them is from someone who already knew about them. Last night was like any other night. I was switching between listening to music and watching YouTube videos with one headphone in so I can hear my infant daughter if she cries. That way, my wife can get a full night's sleep. She works at 4 a.m. at the hospital every day, when I decide to go lay down in the spare bed in the baby's room. Just as I dozed off, I heard a thumping coming from the front porch. Startled at first, I opened my eyes wide and scanned the room. Realizing it was most likely my cat scratching himself on the front porch, I dozed back off. Then again, the thumping. Quote, damn cat, end quote. I got out of bed to run him off the porch, only to see he wasn't there anymore. Now that I was up again, I wasn't the least bit tired. I figured I'd just get some tea and check Facebook while I'm up, maybe finish the web series I was watching on YouTube. A few minutes into the video, I felt the sudden urge to look up at the kitchen window. There they were. The tops of two short-statured people's heads cresting the stairs just above my window frame. The people were just short enough to not see in the window, but I could see out. I heard no footsteps on my porch as my stomach turned, but the knock. The knock was a steady, hollow thump. The very same thump I had just blamed on my cat. Deciding it was best not to answer, I shut my laptop and crept by the door back to the baby's room. I assumed it was some of the people from the low-income housing across the road from me, high or hiding from the cops, or maybe looking for my cousin who stays with me often and has many friends over there. The last thing I needed was to try to explain to two stoners that I was trying to sleep even though it was 2 a.m. It wasn't until I got to my daughter's room that the creepiness set in. The thump had moved from the kitchen to the bedroom windows, both windows, a room apart, thumping in perfect time. These stoners were going to wake up my daughter if I didn't run them off now. Pissed off, I went out to the kitchen, unlocked and opened the door, ready to run around to the side of the house and kick some little idiot's ass. It happened then. Staring up at me were two 10 or 11-year-old boys. The feeling of dread and the smell of mold almost made me vomit. The smaller of the two then spoke, quote, "May we use your telegraph?" End quote. Huh? I just stared blankly at these boys, horrified of what I then realized. Their eyes were pitch black. He asked again to use my, quote, telegraph, end quote. There wasn't a sound to be heard. No crickets chirping, no dogs barking, no cars driving by. Nothing. I tried to play it cool and ignore the fact that he didn't say telephone or phone or cell, anything that would have made any sense of the situation, and calmly replied, quote, "I don't have service at my house. Sorry," end quote. The expressions on their faces turned to rage as I finished my sentence. Swiftly, I shut the door and locked it as quickly as I could, then stumbled back to protect my daughter. I picked her up from her crib and held her close. The fact that she didn't wake up freaked me out the most, but I managed to gather my senses enough to make sure she was still breathing and warm. Everything seemed okay with her. The thumping on the windows was back. I dropped to the floor as close to the wall as I could and held my little girl in my arms and wept like a child. I felt helpless and afraid. I lied there for what felt like hours and hours, crying and shaking until I heard it, my wife's alarm clock. Thumping stopped the instant the alarm went off, and I crept into the master bedroom with the baby. Quote, "What's wrong with you?" End quote, my wife asked. Quote, "I just had a bad dream," end quote, is all I could mutter out. I handed my wife the baby and she fed her like any normal day. I turned on every light in the house and made coffee for her. For some reason, just having her awake calmed my nerves enough to pretend like nothing had happened. I walked her out to the car nervously with the baby in my arms. I asked her not to leave until I walked back in the house. She was put off by the request, but did so to humor me. Once I was safely in the house, I locked the door again, and in the house I sat horrified until she got home. I insisted we go to the next town over and stay the weekend at my brother's house, and here I sit horrified while she sleeps in the guest room with my daughter. Wondering why they had stopped when the alarm went off. I think I know the answer. I was aware of BEKs and she wasn't. Every story I've read about them is from someone who already knew about them. Maybe, just maybe, knowledge of them existing is the only reason they visit. I'm afraid and I'm sorry. No Sleep Trash wrote that story. So, again, guys, sorry about the lighting. I'm working on it. I want to talk about a few things in this story. I don't know if you guys saw my Glimmerman story. I'll put it right here. Or any Glimmerman stories or anything about things happening in the woods. The missing 411 stuff, even. Not just that, but even that. Everything seems to stop. All other life seems to stop. If you're in the house with someone, they're asleep and aren't awakened by anything that would normally wake a regular person up. Outside, there's no crickets, there's no squirrels, there's no wind. Could this phenomenon be connected with the missing 411 stuff, the kids going missing? Also, No Sleep Trash states that he thinks that the knowledge of knowing about them is the reason they visit. That's what Steve and I were just talking about, and that's what he says in his story. So let me know what you think, guys. I know the lighting's a little weird here. I just got a brand new professional lighting setup, and I can't wait to really try it out. Like I said, if the lighting's a little off, I really didn't have time to work on it today. I wanted to make this video spooky. I wish I had time to do the whole thing in this lighting, but I'm sorry I don't. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I know it's a little shorter than the last one. I think it's going to be shorter than the last one. I'm trying to up the creep factor. I hope next Saturday to have more time to really put something super scary together for you guys for Halloween. I'm going to be at my sister's haunted house, so I'll probably film it like the day before. I'm probably going to upload from the haunted house as well because it's going to be super awesome. So be kind to each other, guys. It doesn't cost anything, and make sure you don't answer any middle of the night knocks on the door.